participant.
First of all, let's thank to God, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, the Almighty, who has been giving us mercies and blessings, so we can attend to this event today without any obstacles in this happy place and time. Secondly, salawat and salam be with our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who has guided us from the darkness into the lightness in this world as well as in the next world. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome
Welcome
to
to
the
the
International
International
Webinar
Webinar
2021.
2021, presented by Communication and Islamic Broadcasting in collaboration with Apex Chronicle, by the topic Media Discourse, How the Media Construct Radicalism and Terrorism Issues.
The first agenda is opening, the second is reciting Holy Quran, and the third is sing the national anthem Indonesia Raya and hymn of Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University. The fourth is speech, the fifth is the main session, and the last is closing.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first agenda is opening. Let's start our agenda today by reciting Basmalah together.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Before we go into the next agenda, let us explain the rule of this webinar today. First, host will start Zoom meeting early for the webinar registration. Second, to ensure the security of the session, we will need you to log in using your email address. Third, please make sure that your name is written correctly and using the format name underscore institution. And the last, please turn off your microphone during the session in order to not disrupt the discussion. Those all the rules of the webinar today, and we need to inform all the participants that in the end of this agenda, there will be a link of attendance.
Ladies and gentlemen, the second agenda is reciting the Holy Quran that will be read by Putri Sekargiri, student of Department Communication and Islamic Broadcasting, Faculty of Dawah and Communication. To Putri Sekargiri, the time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وقال يا بني لا تدخلوا من باب واحد وادخلوا لا تدخلوا من باب واحد وادخلوا من أبواب متفرقة وما أغني عنكم من الله من شيء إن الحكم إلا لله إن الحكم إلا لله عليه توكلت وعليه فليتوكل المتوكلون إن الحكم إلا لله عليه توكلت عليه توكلت وعليه فليتوكل المتوكلون صدق الله العظيم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Sadaqallahul Azim. Thank you to Putri Sekargiri. Ladies and gentlemen, the next agenda is sings the national anthem, Indonesia Raya, and hymn of Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University. Ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia Raya and hymn of Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University are always sung in formal events, as a form of nationalism, also a respect to the institution and nation. To all ladies and gentlemen, please raise.
To all ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, the next agenda is welcoming speech that will be delivered by the Dean Faculty of Dakwah and Communication to Professor Dr. Haja Marhuma MPD. The time is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Master Ceremony. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahilladzi 'allama bil qalam, 'allamal insana ma lam ya'lam. Wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Muhammadin khairil anam wa ala alihi wa ashabihi dhawin nufusiz zakiyati wal kiram. Amma ba'du. Excellencies, Rector of UIN Sunan Kalijaga Yogyakarta, Profesor Dr. Pil Almaki. Halo Pak Rektor. Honorable our special speaker in this international seminar, Bapak Ahmad Al-Muhammadi, Associate Fellow at International Center for Terrorism, Malaysia, Bapak Dr. Clark Jones, criminologist from ANU, Andrea Toledo, researcher, journalist from Manila Times, Ahmad Fatih from United Kingdom, Understanding Islamic Tourism in Europe, Bapak Hamdan Daulay from UIN Sunan Kalijaga Yogyakarta, respectable all of audience and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, praises and thanks always be given to our God, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, the most merciful and the powerful Essence, who has given us a lot of mercies and blessing so that we can gather together and conduct this activity online amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, as a Dean of Faculty of Dakwah and Communication, I would like to thank to all of speakers who have been willing to explain, share, and discuss their ideas and experiences, I think, on this important topic to all of us. My thanks also goes to all committees of this international seminar, particularly Head of Islamic Communication and Broadcasting Study Program, Pak Nanang. Before addressing the topic on this seminar as part of our internalization program, I think I would like to say that the purpose of this international seminar is to enrich and expand our knowledge on Islam, communication, and media studies, and its relation, the terrorism and radicalism issues. Also to expand our network and corporation with scholar, with researcher, media practitioner, agencies in Indonesia and also in worldwide. The topic in this seminar, namely media discourse, how the media construct radicalism and terrorism issues. I think this topic is very, very significant and worth to discuss, given the recent development that the radical or terrorist ideologies have infiltrated through the use of new media. As part of scholarly communities, I think we have to address these issues and contribute to it, not only theorizing, but also seeking the for the possible solve this problem. Many studies on religion and media have demonstrated that the rapid development of new media has profoundly changed the way religion and constituted and practiced it with the society. Many studies also have found that many people are radicalized through social media, such as in the case, maybe in ISIS or HTI. Media have a tool for the spirit radical ideologies. Has become a tool for the spirit radical ideologies. And also media can be understood as religious marketable, or in Indonesia we call pasar keagamaan. Pasar keagamaan. That is, religious people can freely choose, consume, share, and internalize religious content that are appealing and relevant to their preferences. In the context of Indonesia, for example, many preachers from both the moderate group or the radical group are using social media to attract many followers, many conveying their preaching and disseminating their ideologies. Media, therefore, can also be understood and place of contestation in which religious discourse and practice are contested. So the moderate versus the radicals, I think, the idea and practice of framing here is also important and relevant, contrasting moderate and peaceful Islam and combating religious radicalism through the use of new media. Now, the question then, how to frame progressive, peaceful, and moderate Islam in media, which is appealing especially to this grassroots, to the youth and urban Muslim who are affected by rapid development and also modernization. I think this important to be discussed, as many research have demonstrated many urban Muslims are attracted to radical group. Why? Because they find it comfortable to express their existence in the midst of destabilizing identity. I think this important to be known. Last of all, may this international seminar be fruitful for us. Terima kasih Pak Nanang, Pak Sinung, dan semua panitia. Sukses selalu untuk Anda. Selamat berseminar. Thank you. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wallahul muwaffiq ila aqwamit thoriq. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you to Professor Marhuma for this speech. And the next is keynote speech that will be delivered by our Rector of Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University to Professor Dr. Pil Almakin SAGMA. The time is yours.
SAGMA. Benar-benar ingat.
Oke, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University. and welcome to the Faculty of Communication. Dear all guests, I wish you happy and please stay healthy. And we also pray together this pandemic should be over soon. And I think at the moment in Indonesia, in many parts of provinces, including in Yogyakarta, we have good news that according to national statistics, the number of people getting infected significantly decreased. And condolences, bad news also significantly decrease. At least on the streets, we don't hear ambulances around to take some people from hospital to hospital. I would like to thank to the committee holding this conference, enabling us to listen to each other, to learn from each other with regard to our researches on issues of media and, quote unquote radicalism. And thanks to Ibu Dekan, Professor Marhumah for warm welcome and very nice words. And dear all guests, thank you very much for your generosity and kindness to attend in this conference and to share your experiences in research. And also, we are ready to listen. Dear all guests and all speakers and all listeners, as Director of Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University, I am very proud of this conference, and I wish there is no more pandemic so that we could physically meet each other directly. However, this pandemic is still alarming, so we have to use this technology. Talking about media and religiosity is indeed very the situation in Indonesia that religions play very significant roles in public. Indonesians mostly describe themselves as being very religious, or in many ways being very pious. Piety, or something that is very religious, is very much in common, not only for politicians. Yes, indeed, politicians use religion and religious image to improve their electability and to improve their image before their potential voters. But also for the actors, for the celebrities, and for many other public figures. Religion is considered an effective tool to improve our acceptance in our community. We have just read one article by Burhanuddin Muhtadi, just published, and I just checked through via Instagram. He questions, to be exact, to put it, whether religion can save corruptors, whether religions can be safe harbor for the corruptors. I think this is very important questions, because in political life in Indonesia, almost all politicians from many political parties, whether the political parties using religious sentiments or secular or nationalist religious, secular or nationalist political parties, all took advantages of religions to boost their electability, to boost their popularity, before the eyes of the people. And I think this should be noted. This is very important fact. And we cannot divorce this reality from the way radicalists and fundamentalists use religions as a shield to protect their ideology of hate, to protect their non-compromise, their non-acceptance to those who are different from them. So we cannot only think that radicalism only emerged in Indonesia because of international network, because of Middle Eastern conflict, because an influence from outside Indonesia on Indonesia. I think we should rethink of that. Because in reality, why radicalism is so robust, why radicalism grows in Indonesia, because of the environment. So scholarly speaking, we should be honest and we should rethink whether we nurture this ideology. And it is indeed another question whether this ideology become a tool to act of violence. That is another question. But there is a strong relation between ideology of marking our identity in terms of religions and marking our difference in terms of our religious identity from the identity of other religions. And I think after the reform period, this identity, religious identity, I mean, is very clear in public. And I think many scholars, both from Indonesia and outside Indonesia, agree that public piety, religiosity in public, and religious identity is significantly used much more than before the reform period. What I mean by reform period is 1998, after the fall of the new order under Suharto. So I think this is a right moment for us to rethink some variables, some indicators in Indonesia particularly, and we should be open-minded to criticize ourselves, and we should also be open-minded to compare what happened in Indonesia with our neighbors, like what happened in Malaysia, what happened in Philippines, in Thailand, and what happened in the Middle East. We are unique because we have our own language, we have our own culture and tradition, but at the same time, others are also unique. So there is nothing can prevent us from comparing us with the rest of the world. So this conference is, I think, a good place and good opportunity to learn not only about religiosity, radicalism, extremism, public space in Indonesia, but please learn what happened in other countries, and please learn using different eyes, using different perspective. And I'm very glad that some guests from Europe, from Malaysia, and from Australia, perhaps, they will contribute to enrich our perspective. And we wish this conference is only just the beginning to collaborate with each other. And Sunan Kalijaga is always welcoming to those who want to work together with us. We are ready to welcome you in our campus. We wish the pandemic is over, and we are ready to visit your campus, and we wish the pandemic is over. Once again, I am very proud of this conference, and there are so many agendas, and we please enjoy conference. Please have a fruitful and productive discussion, and please do not hesitate to propose new ideas in following up this conference in the form of publication and research collaboration. Thank you again. Stay healthy and be happy. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Warahmatullahi
wabarakatuh.
wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much to Professor Al-Makin for the amazing speech. Ladies and gentlemen, the next agenda is the main session of the International Webinar 2021 presented by Communication and Islamic Broadcasting in collaboration with Apex Chronicles. By the topic, Media Discourse, How the Media Construct Radicalism and Terrorism Issues. Well, these are the speaker of the first webinar, Dr. Clark Jones, the criminologist at the Researcher School of Psychology, Australia, National University of Canberra, Australia. Andrea Toledo, the author, researcher, and investigative journalist of Manila Times, Philippines. And Ahmed Patel, the acknowledged contributor, Understanding Islamist Terrorism in Europe, United Kingdom.
This first webinar will be guided by the moderator, Kusuma Sari Ayuning Tias, co-founder of Apex Chronicles. Before we start the plenary session, let us introduce our moderator today. Kusuma Sari Ayuning Tias is a journalist worked for the Jakarta Post in 2011 up to 2020. As stranger for the Greatest Surakarta, in 2016, started working for the Benar News, an online media affiliated with Radio Free Asia and based in Washington, D.C. as Yogyakarta and Central Java correspondent. Then became a contributor for the Southeast Asia Globe, a media outlet based in Cambodia, as well as working since 2012 for Fit Indo, which is an agribusiness industrial news agency based in France until 2021. Since June 2021, she became the correspondent for Deutsche Welle to cover Yogyakarta and Central Java area. She also involved in the research of the Wahid Foundation, an institution that is part of the Abdurrahman Wahid Foundation, how the radicalization process unfolds, in order to help define strategies for the ultimate and critical goals of deradicalization. And since July 2021, developed an online platform, the Apex Chronicle, with her colleges. So, please welcome the Kusumasari Ayuning Tias. The time is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Mas Febri, for the very nice introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I myself, as the moderator, would like to say thank you to the Honorable of Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University Rector Professor Dr. Phil Al-Makin, the Dean of the Faculty of Dakwah and Communication Professor Dr. Hajah Marhumah and staffs, our international speakers, Dr. Clark Jones from Research School of Psychology, Australia National University, Ms. Andrea Toledo, an author, researcher, investigative journalist of Manila Times, Mr. Ahmad Patel, acknowledgement contributor, Understanding Islamist Terrorism in Europe and United Kingdom, and all of the audiences for attending this international webinar, a collaboration between UIN Sunan Kalijaga Yogyakarta with an online independent media platform, the Apex Chronicles. This webinar brings a big theme about media discourse, how the media construct radicalism and terrorism. And after all, the speaker presented their presentation, we will have discussion and question session for about 60 minutes. Okay, at this very moment, I would like to read the short bio of our first speaker, Dr. Clark Jones. Based in Canberra, Dr. Jones is currently a lead researcher in a multidisciplinary research project measuring and improving social cohesion in selected disadvantaged local government areas around Australia. He's also a senior consultant with the UNODC, delivering several projects to the Philippine criminal justice sector. This includes the development of COVID-19 capabilities and response in prison and detention facilities, as well as improving the overall professionalization and capacities in prison and jail management and probationary and parole services. Over the past 10 years, he has run over 60 capacity building courses for key correctional agencies in the Philippines and Indonesia on prison reform issues. Before commencing at the Australian National University in 2010, Dr. Jones worked for over 15 years in various management positions in national security, including policing, military, and intelligence. While in national security intelligence, he developed and led over 100 professional training programs to build counterterrorism capacities for approximately 25 overseas government agencies. Dr. Jones is a regular expert commentator for international and domestic media channels on terrorism and radicalization issues and write regular opinion pieces for print and electronic media. He has been a keynote speaker at a number of domestic and international conferences. His most recent publication is titled Image Radicalization and Recruitment in Prisons for Routledge. In this opportunity, Dr. Jones will presenting Islamophobia, challenging the countering violent extremism discourse in the media today. Without any further delay, please welcome our first speaker, Dr. Clark Jones. Dr. Clark Jones already here, actually. Clark Jones.
Sorry, I was in mute.
Okay, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the kind and lengthy introduction. I'm really honoured to be here today, so thank you very much. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Australia, I find this an extremely important topic. And my opinion or my discussions today are very much based on my own experiences with the media and working with Muslim communities in Australia, but also working with terrorist offenders in the Philippines. They're sort of my two key areas that I work on. I want to start by stating up front that the media are certainly an important source of communication for all of us. I've worked closely with many media outlets to post or talk about positive real life stories about people that, about particularly young people, young Muslims in Australia that have got themselves sometimes into difficult situations. Not always. I've met, of course, many lovely people that I'm still very close friends with. But I also work with those that are life's tough for them. I also write directly to directly with the media to government groups to educate and address contemporary issues, particularly around prison reform in the Philippines, and to President Duterte and other prison and jail leaders on important topics, certainly around terrorist inmate management. And in Australia, around community engagement and ways to work with communities. You've got to remember in Australia and also in the Philippines, it's a Christian majority, not a Muslim majority. So we vary in terms of religiosity between the two countries. But I want to point out there's good media and there's bad media. So I don't want to what I say, please take it constructively, not negatively for the media people that are part of today. But my concern involves sensationalist media outlets that quite openly discriminate against minority communities, which can lead to marginalisation and stigmatisation of young people in those communities. This is particularly the case when some media, and I say some media, not all media, over-conflate terrorism with Muslim youth. So it's not just terrorism, violent extremism, and I use violent extremism and terrorism fairly closely together. But particularly, it's not good for young people, young Muslims growing up in Australia. So my perspectives today come from a variety of different places. I've spent over 4 years conducting longitudinal ethnographic research with several Muslim communities in Sydney and Melbourne, Australia, if you're familiar with Australia, so along the East Coast, a little bit in Western Australia on the West Coast. Quite recently been involved in Auckland in New Zealand. There's a current case at the moment, but there was one tragic case where a young Muslim man was shot dead by police after stabbing 7 people in a supermarket in Auckland. And I was heavily involved in that case back in 2018. I've also worked over 15 years examining correctional environments with terrorist offenders. A large part of this work with terrorist offenders has taken place in Philippine prisons and jails. Prisons being for convicted offenders and jails being for those on remand. And unlike other countries, the Philippines has a large terrorist inmate population that I've been studying quite closely for a long time. So I've been studying how they cope with the prison system itself. Remember, it being a Catholic majority country, and how Muslim prisoners in general cope within that sort of system, how they deal with the inmate culture, and how this may or may not impact on prison radicalisation. Through the book I published recently in Routledge with a colleague, our views on prison radicalisation, I would say, are quite radical themselves, but we've been able to observe and spend time with offenders. So our opinions are in very close contact with those we've worked with. And there are a little bit different from the current rhetoric out there that you might see in the media and what you might see that are promoted by other academics. In Australia, I continue to work closely with communities, Muslim communities, non-government groups and government organisations to develop intervention programs to support vulnerable youth, and those already in the criminal justice system. So that might be kids that have been in and out of trouble with the police, those that are already in the correctional system, but probably more importantly, to try and support those coming out of the criminal justice system, to try and give them the most important chance at life to get back on their feet, back into the communities, and hopefully prevent them from recidivating and getting back into the criminal justice system. So the work is about support. It's an important thing to think about, support. In my research, I haven't conducted the usual style of research with questionnaires and surveys, or even with formal interviews. Instead, I've immersed myself into Muslim communities to examine daily lives, how kids get along, how they interact with others, Muslims and non-Muslims, and also being involved with community activities. And all of my work is really what's called community-based participatory work. It's not the world according to me or the world according to others. It's really how they get along and how they react. And this is a really important point. It's not easy work. Being someone of my background, I certainly participate in community meetings, conferences, youth camps. I've been on many youth camps where I go out camping in the bush with young people to hear their stories, to engage. I get involved in sporting activities, religious lectures, family events. I've been to weddings, just family get-togethers. Whenever I drive from where I live here in Canberra down to my mother's place, I will always stop and catch up with my Muslim colleagues just to say hello. I get involved in shura meetings, but all of the work and all the things I do is really about developing trust, equal partnerships in everything I do. Working in the prison system in the Philippines has been significantly more challenging, particularly around conducting participant observation studies. It's never been just about terrorist offenders. It's also about working with prison gangs and other inmates. It's been an interesting journey, probably a discussion we can have at another time. But it's really getting to know people, what got them there in the first place. Certainly to understand different personalities, understand their needs, their histories and backgrounds. It's certainly been a really sort of a fascinating experience being accepted amongst those people. And I won't say those people, I mean, I still know a lot of the people that are incarcerated. It's been very difficult over the last couple of years with COVID lockdowns. And I haven't been back to the Philippines since 2009. But I really hope that things open up next year, that I can get back to meet some of my old friends in the Philippines. But I want to know much about their life stories. And often these life stories is not what you will hear in the media articles or broadcasts. Often that sort of reporting is very sensationalized, particularly when it comes to terrorist offenders. And the reason for offending will vary considerably between offenders. I remember some of the fighters that were involved in the Maute group, part of the Marawi conflict back in 2015, 2016. But some of them joined terrorism because it simply paid more. It paid more than being on the rice fields. There was no ideological reason for their fighting, nothing to do with religion, but simply it was a economical motivation. In relation to my community-based research, it's back into Australia, it's allowed me to see the world through a different lens. It's a more personal lens that sheds a light on what you might see in the media today, the key topic under discussion. In what I say does not mean, as a criminologist, it doesn't mean that I am soft on crime. Please don't get the right idea. But if I'm going to work with groups that are in very difficult situations, circumstances in prison or outside of prison, I want to know more about them so I can then address their needs, their criminogenic needs, and develop programs to better support them. So that is my framing, and this is where I come from. And what I see is different to what I see in the media. But in all situations, by developing close and trusted relationships and mutual respect, by having empathy to different life circumstances, I have been able to get a real understanding of key challenges facing communities, families, and young people. Some of these challenges, which is a key part of my presentation today, some of these challenges are around Islamophobia and racism, particularly in Australia and other Western countries. And Ahmed might talk a little bit about that in the UK a bit later. Some of the challenges are around youth crime and violent extremism and other antisocial behaviours. I want to highlight, when I talk about violent extremism, I don't take it away from youth crime or other antisocial behaviours. Certainly in research I did with some other academics at the Australian National University a few years years ago, we found that youth challenges are many. Violent extremism is a very, very small aspect of those youth challenges. An important topic, don't get me wrong, but it's not the only outcome for vulnerable young Muslims in Australia. So from all of this, my main premise for you today is that countering violent extremism or even preventing violent extremist programs can be potentially harmful and can contribute to the very problems they are trying to address. Now, that is if they are conducted without cultural and religious understanding. So if you recall what I've just said about getting to know people, getting to understand, one of the big reasons is also to understand cultural and religious differences, having an understanding of those. Not saying that they're driving the problem, but they're certainly important if I'm going to work with young people to get them away from offending. Let me start by saying that we shouldn't confuse countering violent extremism with counter-terrorism and the important work police and security and intelligence services do. Having spent many years in that field, I know how important that is. I also know that the efforts by governments and others to curb violent extremism through countering violent extremism, or CVE, does not intend to cause harm to Muslim communities. But unfortunately, sometimes it does. And this is what I want to get to about Islamophobia and how that results, but I'll talk about that shortly. However, what was once counter-terrorism has now morphed into an industry of experts, government groups and agencies, and academics all vying for funding and dominance to run countering violent extremism programs. I have great problems with this. These programs are picked up in the media, and this is what I want to get to and related to the media. These programs are picked up by the media, and they portray young Muslims and their communities as somehow suspicious. And this is what's given birth to the suspect community, certainly in Australia, where you get this conflation of Muslim communities with terrorism. It's been a terrible development, and it certainly has given birth to the rise of Islamophobia. I'm going to go so far, and this is very controversial, but I want to be constructive. I'll go so far as to say that some countering violent extremism strategies can contribute to the underlying issues that drive a young person to commit acts of violence or other crimes. For example, poorly constructed programs can contribute to stigmatization of Muslim youth and work towards dividing them from the communities, schools, and families where belonging and connection and identity is absolutely vital. Now, one of the main problems is that young Muslims are often portrayed in the media as a risk rather than at risk. So that's a really important point, that the media see Muslim youth as a risk, not as vulnerable or at risk. Coupled with the negative media attention and associated politicking around violent extremism. So violent extremism, particularly around voting time, is picked up by politicians. Get tough on violent extremism, get tough on terrorism, get tough on national security. So the CVE industry, the countering violent extremism industry, has led to heightened attention and pressure on Muslim communities. That is, Muslim communities are somehow responsible, and Muslim community leaders need to do more. And it doesn't, if you go and search in the media, particularly Australian media, you will go back where politicians have placed pressure on Muslim communities to say that they need to somehow do more to address violent extremism. The so-called suspect community has led to a strong surge of Islamophobia from the broader community in Australia and other Western nations. Experts have come from all fields, some relevant and some not. Even as a criminologist, I get concerned. I get concerned that people who are not criminologists or psychologists that come from totally different fields come in to provide advice on violent extremism, which can be damaging. From that, it means it's not uncommon for Muslim youth to not want to participate in programs or interventions. The reality is that many families and communities want nothing to do with countering violent extremism programs because of the potential harmful outcomes and negativity or stigma associated with participation in such programs. However, addressing any sort of violent crime in society is crucial. But whatever strategies we develop, they should not contribute to crime or more crime. They should seek to understand the causal factors, identify the needs, be culturally and religiously sensitive, and provide appropriate, tailored individual solutions. But many of the causal factors of crime and violent crime, and each person who is at risk of conducting crime or violent crime has a very different story to tell. And it's from these stories that I learn that can help provide better input to more tailored solutions. Getting back, this is not about not providing solutions or not working in countering violent extremism, but it's about building better strategies so that communities and family and young people want to be involved. At the moment, that is not the case. But to suggest a de-radicalization program is solution often misses the point and fails to understand and consider causal factors and needs. So it's very, when we see things in the media or things are reported in the media, we see about, implementing a de-radicalization program. What does that mean? In the end, they tend to throw Islam under the bus. That Islam is the key issue contributing to crime. But that's not true. We know Islam to be a religion of peace. And when you talk to young people, you will see there are other underlying issues that lead to crime. And religion, Islam, is quite the opposite. In research and in a research project I'm doing at the moment, or I would say one of my students is doing at the moment, is about looking at the protective factors of Islam. Islam has nothing to do with offending, generally. There are exceptions, but generally it has nothing to do with the crime. De-radicalization suggests that the person was radicalized. And that's a radicalization. That's a concept that is poorly understood and overemphasized by those with biased lenses and can only frame crime committed by Muslims in one narrow perspective. I want to ask the question back, and how often do police and other parties running de-radicalization programs sit with the community, sit with families, sit with young people to co-design solutions? That is to support, not prosecute at-risk youth. But the trend, unfortunately, today is to prosecute, not support. And that is a concern. A current trend is to see young people trip up and enter the criminal justice system. And as a criminologist, I see that as a very slippery slope from there. What we should be thinking about is supporting and preventing crime. And once again, that's another story that I could speak hours and hours on, but I'll move on. Most of the time, the countering violent extremism officials and experts do not consult. And the programs are created well away from the target communities, hoping that the program is somehow welcome and will somehow fit. And I say somehow welcome because often it is not welcome. Often there is little understanding of families, different cultures, extended families, and social networks that may that may influence positive or negative behavior, or may be influential in a person's life. But this understanding is difficult to obtain without firstly developing trust and mutual respect. In fact, in my research, I have found a causal link between lack of trust and criminal behavior. And when I've studied and spent a lot of time with prison gangs, I think the formation of gangs gangs create because they don't trust the outside environment. They don't trust the security in the prison. So they create gangs and groups to provide their own protection. So there are other sides to gangs, but this is not a presentation on gangs. So I will say we will not be safer until other approaches are developed, where consultation, trust, empathy, and mutual respect are at the core of the initiatives. And in terms of crime prevention, as a criminologist, we need to get the basics right. And the programs need to be more ecologically sound before any positive headway can be made. Violent extremism is obviously a critical issue of today's society, but let's address the real issues such as Islamophobia, racism, marginalisation, alienation, and only then we might start to make some headway to a safer, more inclusive society. I want to talk about the pressure placed on Muslim communities a little bit more, and how somehow Muslim communities are complicit in terrorism. We've probably all heard government leaders call on Muslim leaders in the media to do more whenever there's a terrorist incident. And that's been particularly the case in Australia. Implicit in these calls is that the Muslim leaders and their communities somehow know those involved in violent extremism. There's also an unrealistic view that all Muslims should be involved with countering violence for countering violent extremist solutions.
Dr. Clark?
Yes?
Excuse me, you have 5 minutes left.
That's all right. I'm moving through. Thank you for the
Okay.
warning.
Yes. Yes, you can.
So as I've already mentioned, Muslim communities are often treated with suspicion, particularly after a terrorist event where the perpetrator is Muslim. In the media, the entire community is then somehow considered responsible by the broader Australian community. It's particularly damaging, but there are many negative outcomes. But the way the incidents are reported often results in Islamophobia and ongoing racism. A significant other negative outcome is the rise of far-right groups as some kind of justified countermeasure to the so-called Muslim threat. Now, noting I've only got 5 minutes, I won't give you those my own personal experiences, but even working with governments to try and get cooperation. And I've worked with one group that is, you could arguably be highly conservative, but a group called Alus Sunnah wal Jama'ah in Australia, forgive my poor pronunciation. But I've worked with this group for quite a number of years, highly conservative in Australia, but I've developed close colleagues and working with this community to try and get support by government. But rather than the government working with this group, they're considered as too high a risk. And I see that really as being Islamophobic and not wanting to work with community groups that are really trying to do their best to support young people. And it's been, an issue that's really close to my heart, and I still can't understand why more effort is not made by particularly the Australian government and state governments to work with communities. If we are to work with communities on violent extremism, we must be conscious that most Muslim communities around Australia have little or no connection to terrorism, or those that sympathise or have any sympathies to violent extremist groups. Governments must be careful not to throw out a net to all communities, as this conflates a non-violent religion with the violent acts of terrorism. Media tend to be the same, nearly always conflating Muslims to terrorism. The final area I want to cover is around the term of radicalisation, which is used by many actors in all areas of the criminal justice system, in politics and non-government circles, academia and the media. The term is used by different people to mean different things. Perspectives will vary between different countries. To me, what is a radical may vary considerably with what you think it means. Its actual meaning, if there is one, is more intricate than most understand. Overall, there is no agreed definition, although a lot of research has been undertaken and progress is slowly being made. I'll just sum up here. In summing up, I want to stress the need for more effective engagement with communities, more equal engagement. With a more intimate understanding of community needs, we will be able to better direct support where it's needed. When I say support, I'm not referring to CV efforts as the primary reason for engagement. I mean genuine engagement to understand key issues, which can eventually be addressed through equal partnerships and mutual strategies. This will only occur through effective consultation and trust building. I would also like to be, more constructive and see less biased reporting when it comes to incidents involving Muslim youth. I honestly think that things are changing for the good, where police are being very careful when identifying offenders and reporting to the media. Therefore, unbiased reporting may start to reduce Islamophobia and help curb the growth of far-right actors in our communities. I'll leave it at there. Thank you so much for allowing me to present my findings and my experiences. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Clark, for the very interesting presentation. We hope you can stay with us until the discussion and question session. Okay. Okay, that was the presentation from Dr. Jones about his experiences as well as his work and his various efforts in about 15 years for countering violent extremism as the researcher, writer, and author, and how he found that the media have both sides, bringing negativity but also positivity and effect to the youth. And now we have Andrea Toledo, an author, researcher, and investigative journalist of Manila Times. Andrea Toledo, or more familiar as Trey Toledo, is surviving daughter from Antonio Toledo, one of New People Army of or NPA leader in Philippines. NPA is a communist terrorist organization and connected with Communist Party of the Philippines or CPP and National Democratic Front or NDF. Trey bravely decided to fight against radicalism, terrorism, and also his own father, using her journalist platform since 2017. Today, Trey will share her story, research, and her experiences in this international webinar. Without any further delay, please welcome Ms. Andrea Toledo. Trey, you there?
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Sia. I would like to greet our distinguished participants and guests. Pleasant good morning. My presentation today is focused on how I use social media to fight terrorism. This topic is timely since youth and child soldier.
Trey, will you share by yourself or you will share on the presentation?
Kindly share from your side, yeah, if it's okay.
From the side.
Yes.
Okay, we will help you to share.
I will try to share if it's difficult. Just one moment. It's a host disabled participants screen sharing, so it has to come from the host. Yeah.
Yes, yes. They will make you as the co-host.
While they are loading my presentation, this topic is very timely since youth and child soldier recruitment into terrorist organizations is prevalent in the Southeast Asian region. I would like to begin my presentation by touching upon the context of using social media in narrative warfare to fight terrorism. May I request for the host to begin the slide?
We already made you as the co-host. You can share by yourself or you want us to
Okay.
share? Yes.
Okay, I will share now. Okay, so just one moment. Okay, so this presentation is, of course, very important to me, and I'm very grateful that Yas was able to invite me in this discussion. And I would like to share that my use of social media to fight terrorism began earlier than 2017, but it became more personal in 2017 while I was covering the Marawi siege, because my mother, who's actually a high-ranking leader of the NPA, along with my father, my entire clan on both my mother's side and my father's side are high-ranking terrorist leaders of the New People's Army, the communist terrorist network and the armed wing of the Communist Party of the Philippines. My mother was sadistically tortured and she was murdered by my own father. The torture lasted for 9 months and 5 days. And it was a very, there are no words to describe the grief, the difficulty, the trauma that I had to process during this time. And it coincided with my coverage of the Marawi siege and an entire year. So when I decided to come out, I was able to make use of my platform as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, to publish a series of stories about the communist terrorist network within my clan, both from my mother's side and my father's side, to condemn my father. And at the time when I publicly condemned my father, the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army was not yet designated as a terrorist organization by the Philippine government. So I began to fight back. November 2017, I sought the help of the Philippine government, and there was a very quick response. By December 2017, the CPP NPA, the Communist Party, and the Armed Wing, New People's Army, were both designated as terrorist organizations by the Philippine government. However, the formerly legal arm, the National Democratic Front, the NDF, which is the shield, the legal shield of the CPP-NPA Communist Terrorist Network, was only designated as a terrorist organization in the Philippines. This 2021. And I use social media to fight terrorism by applying the 4 primary principles, which I would like to share now. I would like to request one of our guests to mute their microphone so that there's no interference. Thank you very much. So educators and media professionals who are not aligned with the Communist Party, the Communist Terrorist Network in the Philippines, constantly invite me to speak on TV, radio, Twitter Spaces, and vlog interviews via Facebook live streaming to address the youth and the parents about the radicalization tactics of the CPP-NPA-NDF communist terrorist group in the Philippines. In this particular endeavor, it's important to develop connections in order to build an audience for your content. What I mean by this is people don't really care about what you know until they know that you care. And it might sound cliche, but it's true. And the children, the youth leaders, the parents, the teachers, they need to know that you care by fostering that relationship, that personal relationship. Earlier, Dr. Clark was mentioning that he would always take out, significant time on his way to his mother in Canberra just to meet with his Muslim friends. And that kind of connection is important both offline and online. Second is to analyze. We must share our thoughts and insights on current events to break down the propaganda of terrorists. And in the Philippines, the propaganda of communist terrorists is especially strong, and it contributes the most to the fostering to the cultivation of Islamophobia, which is very harmful to our children and to our Muslim children, our Muslim youth in the Philippines. The communist terrorists, in particular, they have deeply infiltrated the Philippine government for the last 91 years. So this is almost a century. When we talk of the Communist Party of the Philippines and the National Democratic Front and the New People's Army today, being 53 years, it's only the second Communist Party in the Philippines. The first Communist Party is Partido Comunista Pilipinas of 1930. So we have been waging the longest war against this insurgency, against terrorism, and the government of the Philippines only responded to this national security threat in December of 2017. So the third, which is very important when using social media to fight terrorism, is to identify, call a spade, point out and highlight personalities that support terrorism. I know that a lot of journalists, a lot of social media influencers, they are very cautious when it comes to naming names. In my case, because I belong to a clan of high-ranking terrorist leaders, I know who they are and I can name them. I can call them out. I can call out the network of my father. I can call out all the politicians that my terrorist father supports. And I do that without any fear, because I know that social media is the only equalizer that we have to fight terrorists, especially terrorists as strong as the CPP, NPA, NDF Communist Terrorist Network in the Philippines. And then fourth is to advertise. When I say advertise in social media, it means to promote books, to promote documentaries, to promote short videos that explain the roots and elements of terrorism in a manner and in a format that is relatable to kids and parents. So when we make use of Facebook, of Twitter, of Instagram, of the TikTok dance and all other applications that go viral, even online games, it is important to be able to promote these works countering violent extremism and to be able to help children and parents navigate this very complex environment wherein there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that foster agitation, organization, and mobilization of targeted recruits of terrorist organizations. Now, when I launched my website, AndreaToledo.com, before I was thinking, it was sufficient to have, as a journalist, I did not need my own website. I was not particularly keen on it. But then in the Philippines, Facebook started regularly shadow banning the accounts, personal accounts and Facebook pages of the strong proponents of counterterrorism. Because this is not because of the Facebook company itself, but it is because the Communist Terrorist Network is highly organized, and they have dedicated teams that match reports particular posts, match reports particular pages, and particular Facebook accounts to restrict the sharing the content. And therefore, it is essential that if you have important content that regularly gets shadow banned on some platforms of social media, even Facebook, it's important to have your own website so that at least your audience, the connections that you have already built, you have already fostered through the years, will have a constant source of information in case you get shut down on your social media accounts by the mass reporting of communist terrorist operatives and their team online. giving regular interviews to TV, to radio is essential, but the impact is stronger these days to counter terrorism. It is still stronger to counter the narrative, the propaganda of terrorists using social media. So even if we do interviews on TV, on radio, we still share the content on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok. When I was covering the Marawi siege from May of 2017, long after the October 2018 conclusion, and I stayed even a year after that during the rehabilitation, I was covering the Marawi siege not with the predictable bias of journalists in the Philippines, and I do not intend to malign other practitioners, other mass media practitioners, but I am just stating a fact that a lot of my colleagues in the Philippines, in the mainstream media, are either members of the Communist Party or they are receiving bribes from Communist Party members. And so there is always a constant void or vacuum in proper dissemination of information. So for example, in Marawi, the Western and local mainstream media, they were really sensationalizing every single aspect of the war. Nobody highlighted, except for my report, nobody highlighted the fact that the only affected area during the Marawi siege was less than 15% of Marawi city, meaning more than 70% of Marawi city remained intact, and the main battle area was only within the commercial center, which is less than 15% of Marawi city. And covering war for me is not just a question of covering the aspects of the, I would make use of my drone to fly, to take videos with the permission of the armed forces of the Philippines, so that I could show that more than 70% of Marawi city was actually intact, and that the armed forces of the Philippines was actually successful in containing the conflict within only 15% of Marawi city. And in order to be objective, in order to be honest, to be forthright, it is important to be an independent investigative journalist. So while I publish my works with the Manila Times, I also syndicate and publish my works with other foreign news agencies, because I know that there is just too much white noise, and the propaganda of the communist terrorists in the Philippines, they like to flame the fires of Islamophobia. And therefore, when we cover the war, for me it is essential that I go look for the child soldiers. As an investigative journalist, my priority has always been in the in-depth study of terrorism financing and tracking down the ISIS child soldiers radicalized and exploited by the terrorist group led by Isnilon Hapilon. In this particular slide, we can see when I was able to enter these areas, I was able to enter because I am not a soldier, because I am a journalist. I only carry a pen and a paper and a camera. And by doing so, I was able to track down child soldiers that were recruited and radicalized by ISIS, by Daesh, in different parts of Lanao, in southern Philippines, southern Mindanao. Madrasas are places of learning and of discovery of the faith. Unfortunately, terrorists and terrorist organizations in the Philippines make use of madrasas to promote their radical ideas. While online radicalization is the primary mode of recruitment in urban areas, in far-flung or geographically isolated areas in the Philippines, face-to-face recruitment in schools and universities are still the predominant method for radicalization by terrorist groups. Now, in the Philippines, we have almost 79 million social media users out of 110 million Filipinos worldwide. Among social media users in the Philippines, Facebook was the most used platform, accounting for almost the entire social media market. And thanks to the Internet.org app introduced by Facebook and Smart Communications Incorporated in 2015, Filipino internet users were given free access to a few mobile sites, including Facebook and Facebook Messenger apps, even without a mobile network connection. For many Filipinos, the platform was not only used for social networking, but also as a daily source of news, beating newspapers and the radio. Despite Facebook's popularity in the Philippines, other social platforms such as YouTube and TikTok were gradually gaining space in the market, particularly among content creators. In addition, television networks have also been growing their presence on YouTube, as reflected in the most viewed channels as of August 2021. The regular exposure of Filipinos on average is 4 hours per day, and we have a 94% penetration rate of 4G mobile connection in the Philippines. So long before Philippines became the center of Facebook in Southeast Asia for the most active users, we were already known as the texting capital in the world. And of course, Philippines does not offer the SMS feature of text messaging for free. So even if it is paid, Filipinos are so eager to communicate that Filipinos are willing to pay for the load of their cell phones just to send even text jokes. And so you can just imagine that kind of culture of hyperconnectivity among Filipinos is simply translated into the social media use that we know today. The constant need for social interaction, especially in an archipelago like the Philippines, divided by over 7,000 islands, and with an increasing number of more than 10 million overseas workers, were among the leading factors that contributed to the growing number of social network users in the Philippines. On average, the 4 hours or more that Filipinos make use of, they are mostly seen using it on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. And this creates a way to connect and bridge distances between family and friends, which enabled content creators to share information through digital media. So even for our works in countering violent extremism, it is important to be able to make use of these platforms, because the children and the grandchildren of overseas Filipino workers are primary targets for recruitment by the communist terrorist network in the Philippines. And this happens, they are the most vulnerable because they don't have the parental supervision. And so it is easy for communist terrorist recruiters to get the children of households with one or both parents working as overseas Filipino workers. In recent times, extremists have been looking into violent extremism through the use of social networking sites such as Facebook and Twitter, with additional inroads into YouTube, all of which are used by terrorists for propaganda, for recruitment, and for fundraising. This is highly problematic because we see a lot of crowdfunding that are orchestrated by communist terrorist operatives, and they do this in Facebook using different crowdsourcing fundraising applications. And thus far, Philippines has not prosecuted or investigated any of such activities wherein the money raised through fundraising using both Facebook and other crowdsourcing applications went through the activities of terrorist organizations. So this is a place of improvement for the Philippine government. Using social media as a weapon through the internet, the extremists luring in people who are susceptible to their content, recruiting individuals in their extremist groups and missions, and finally planning and executing terror attacks in different parts of the world. So it's not only in the Philippines, but even in the United States, in UK, and many parts of the world, we make the use of social media to recruit young people, and even overseas Filipino workers that are courted by terrorists that are in training in Syria. The OFW sometimes send money. You know, they are the ones who send money to help Daesh terrorists. Now, for social media, from the perspective of boomers and Gen Xers, social media is a mere tool for socialization. Whereas for millennials and post-millennials, social media is an extension of one's self-identity. It is a fusion of freedom of expression and a source of active discovery and learning. Through social media, though social media is considered to be an indirect form of communication, young social media users gravitate towards the extremes of anonymity, making use of avatars or troll accounts, and the need for popularity or having the like addiction, you know, having the thumbs up. And since social media provides a layer of anonymity or distance in terms of physical proximity, users tend to be more open about their personal views, as it is far easier to find like-minded individuals in cyberspace who can affirm one's position or views on a diverse range of topics and interests. However, while this is the upside of the use of social media, it also may lead to polarization and children and youth leaders being trapped in echo chambers in social media that is facilitated by communist terrorist operatives. At least in the case of the Philippines, there is more danger coming from the communist terrorists than from the radical extremists linked to Abu Sayyaf, to Daesh, Southeast Asia, Philippines, Jamaya Islamiyah. We have a greater problem when it comes to the CPP and PA-NDF communist terrorist network. Now, earlier, Dr. Clark mentioned about the issues, the challenges of the Philippines, especially when it comes to children that are imprisoned or incarcerated, youth offenders that are imprisoned in the same cell as adults. And some of them are imprisoned with murderers, with terrorists, and therefore the prison system becomes like a graduate school for organized crime. And this is very unfortunate. So of course, in 2006, we were able to pass the Juvenile Justice Law, or Republic Act 9344, which sets the minimum age of criminal liability at 15 years old. This means that those between 15 to 18 years old may be detained in youth centers and go through rehabilitation programs. However, and this is a big however, the loopholes of this law have been exploited by terrorist organizations to recruit children and youth to commit murder, distribute illegal drugs, commit arson and other crimes. And due to this law, these children and youth do not go to prison, but merely undergo rehabilitation programs under the Department of Social Welfare and Development, or DSWD, which is severely understaffed to do proper rehabilitation for children, and thereby allows them to go home unreformed, and these children continue committing crimes without any accountability and legal consequences. Terrorist organizations and criminal networks take advantage of the law protecting minors from criminal liability. The Juvenile Justice Law of the Philippines is one example of a very well-intentioned law that had many unintended consequences in the Philippine setting, as it got exploited by transnational organized crime and terrorist groups that have turned to recruiting younger and younger members into their ambit of bad influence and criminal activity. This is something very personal to me because my mother was recruited by the New People's Army as a child soldier. And committing murder, bombing, and all these things without any criminal liability, there was no, and also the Department of Social Welfare and Development, they never really had a solid program for rehabilitation. So the problem is, once children are drawn into the ambit of terrorist organizations, it's hard for them to get out. They are continuously exploited to commit crimes that forever traumatize them and scar them for life, because these terrorist organizations and the organized crime that they are part of, they know that the children can commit the crimes without any consequence. So that is one very important unintended consequence that, it would be good to have a discussion, and an in-depth discussion about this at a later time. Next is the concept of hyperconnectivity vis-a-vis radicalization. The phenomenon of hyperconnectivity or hyperconnection produces anxiety. If children feel disconnected from adults in their immediate physical surrounding, they are quick to turn to online sources for attention and affirmation, whether good or bad. Hyperconnectivity to the Internet of Things that is largely unsupervised by responsible adults like parents, guardians, and teachers may lead to radicalization of children and youth. Popular online video or virtual reality games have a large component of socialization and community. Virtual tribes, teams, and clans get created, which give users a strong sense of belongingness. However, as most games are by nature designed to entertain with different kinds of violence, without any proper guidance from parents to balance the media exposure of their children, this can lead to also violent behavior. In my experience, when I was tracking down some of the child soldiers that were recruited and radicalized by ISIS in Marawi, I was able to find out that these children, before ISIS took refuge in Marawi City, before they occupied Marawi City, these children were used as drug couriers for crystal meth, the biggest crystal meth laboratory in Mindanao that was part of what was bombed during the siege, because it was funding narco-terrorism. It was funding not only Daesh, not only Abu Sayyaf, but also the CPP, NPA, and NDF Communist Terrorist Network. And the children were, some of them, they were doing what they were doing both for the drug couriers and then later on as child soldiers for ISIS. They were doing it because they wanted to play games. That's simple. They wanted to have enough allowance. They wanted to have enough allowance so they can buy load, so they can play mobile legends, to be able to play their favorite game. And so children will be children. And narrative warfare, I will have to speed this up, but narrative warfare is essential. And in order to do this, we must all come from an authentic place. So coming from a place of vulnerability and authenticity, I opened up my own family's life stories and involvement in the communist terrorist network. People will always respond to truth telling. So facts-based and evidence-based arguments presented as stories are the most compelling for both children and parents to understand. When I see lies and deception, I always take time to explain and break down the core issue into digestible parts. I also make use of sense of humor. I post funny memes so that children can understand the radical consequences of being part of terrorist organizations. I take my time to explain all these, and I break down these issues. I give a historical background and a fuller social context surrounding issues clouded by misinformation, disinformation, lies, and propaganda. Through social media, I actively reach out to parents and educators to educate them, to inform them how terrorists deceive, groom, and recruit children into terrorist organizations online and offline. It's very important to establish relationship with mothers because they are the first line of defense in detecting if their children are being already radicalized online. It's
Hello, Dre.
essential to be able.
Hello,
Yes?
Dre. You have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, yeah.
Okay.
It's essential to be able to feature both communist terrorist surrenderers and the children of terrorists that never got recruited, that never got radicalized, despite their own life experiences. Real life stories of children who grew up surrounded by conflict need to be studied in depth. So here we see that hyperconnectivity causes anxiety to children, and therefore as parents and as guardians, we need to always be there for the children that we have or the children that we guide, so that they will be able to get their supervision, their inspiration from law-abiding citizens and not from terrorist recruiters. This is one of my books, Narrative Warfare 1 is part of a series, Inside the Mind of the General Who Cannot Be Defeated by Communist Terrorists. And this is the core of narrative warfare to defeat the CPP and PNDF Communist Terrorist Network in the Philippines is simple truth telling. And this is what I always say. Narrative warfare highlights the fact that contemporary wars are largely wars of influence. So make use of social media so that it's an equalizer. All of us have access to it. So make use of it so that you can encourage your friends, your family members not to join terrorist organizations. On the slide, you see on the left side, reader of one of my books, Crossing the Red Line and Masking Covert Communist Terrorists, reached out to me because their mother was brutally shot in the head by the men of my father, the communist terrorist hitmen in Mindanao. And their mother was shot straight in the forehead in broad daylight because she was pro-government and because she's anti-communist. She's a devout Christian woman. And another book that I have is Communist Termites, and it's about stories of how communist terrorists destroy religions and families from within. This book is important because here you can also understand how communist terrorists in the Philippines make use of their propaganda to fan the flames of Islamophobia. Because some of them pretend to be Balik Islam. They pretend to have converted to Islam, and then they commit acts of terrorism and then blame it on Islam, which is a religion of peace. So this book, it became a bestseller in the Philippines. I hope some of you can read it. It's available on Amazon for international readers. And I know that my time is up. I look forward to interacting with you during the question and answer portion later on. Thank you very much, Tias, and I hope to be able to have your questions later on. And thank you again for inviting me.
Okay, thank you, Dre, for sharing your impressive story and presentation with us. Fight against terrorism is not easy, never easy. Meanwhile, Dre not only fight terrorism, but also fight her own father and fight for her principle, what she believes, and also fight for her life. Okay, now I would like to open the question and answer session. You can ask directly to Dr. Clark Jones and Mr. Andrea Toledo or drop it by chat. But please mention your name and your institution where you are come from. And we already have some question from the chat. From Anas to Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark, you still here?
Yes, I am. Yep.
Yes. There is a question from Anas from KPI Studio Program to Dr. Clark. He said that some of us believe that terrorism issue was made by Western. Could you please convince us that terrorism is problems for all religions and countries? You want me to read all the question first, or you want to answer it one by one?
Probably just to answer the question one by one, but could you just repeat that question quickly again?
Okay. Some of us believe that terrorism issue was made by Western. Could you please convince us that terrorism is problems for all religions and countries?
Look, I firstly believe terrorism is a problem for all countries, but there are international drivers and international factors, whether they be created by Western nations or by other reasons, by other countries. there's a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about the invasion of different countries, the invasion of Iraq, for example, the invasion of Afghanistan, that would then have an ongoing effect that may drive those into terrorism or be a driver for terrorism. So does the West have a role to play in the in some of the causal factors of terrorism? Yes, certainly. It really depends on the point of view. I mean, you know, I think every country has a right to self-defense, and I think I'll be careful on how I say this. And there are some war atrocities. I mean, even the Australian Special Air Services at the moment are under investigation for their abuse of innocent Afghans in the Afghan war. And there was sort of a very large inquiry that finished only fairly recently. Now, some of those being involved in some of the social media that has come out as a result of those sorts of investigations, most, well, certainly the people I work with, most will be able to rationalise and work with some of those atrocities and work constructively or positively towards that. But there are also those that are, you know, it's argue more at risk or more vulnerable that may use those excuses to take actions into their own hands, and then some will call that radicalised. Now that has a Western connotation, but when you look at, and I don't want to steal any thunder around the Philippines, but certainly the reasons for terrorism in the Philippines are certainly nothing to do with, or some of the people that I've interviewed in the Philippines is certainly the reasons for terrorism has nothing to do with Western influence. So it really depends on where we're talking about and who you're talking to, but there are different justifications for the use of violence and getting involved in terrorism, and I think we need to be very conscious of those differences and not just blame the West for everything. I mean, I certainly find that a fascinating question, and the answer is yes, sometimes, no, sometimes. To be very basic.
Okay, and now in the chat room, Mr. Aditya Hadiwasito, Security Manager, want to ask question directly by microphone. Maybe Mr. Aditya can unmute. Yes, okay, please.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mrs. Toledo. I am Aditya Hadiwasita. I ask to you direct from my microphone. The Islamophobia phenomenon, people must understand that the culture of Western country is very thick by religious value side of Islam. This has more or less influence the perception of people in Western company toward Islam and its adherents. Islamophobia emerged as a result of globalization decades ago. For the example, in England, suspicion of adherence of Islam arose when many immigrants came there is in period 1970 until 1980. The Islamophobia there is fueled by the native British hatred of immigrants. After that, Islamophobia infect most people in non-Muslim country after the 9/11 WTC tower bombing in the result of research entitled Islamophobia and its origin. Mr. Hengdecker and Van der Nol mentioned Islamophobia as the negative attitude and the behavior of society toward Islam and its adherents. So Islamophobia and fear of the other identity can perpetuate discriminatory practice in society. If this is allowed, democracy with its fact respect difference will be threatened. So what do you think about this phenomenon? That's the question. Thank you.
In the Philippines, thank you for that question, Mr. Aditya. For the situation of the Philippines, we really do not have, contrary to the claims of the journalist Maria Ressa in the international community, that she's saying that there is no democracy in the Philippines. This is not true. In the Philippines, the reporters are very much free to publish whatever they want, which is both good and bad. It becomes bad because sometimes when they publish stories that that incite Islamophobia, this is not something that is easily questioned in a country that is predominantly Catholic, because Philippines is the bastion of Catholicism in Southeast Asia. And so if there are articles, news reports that are very discriminatory to our Muslim brothers and sisters, they are not easily put to question. And the communist terrorist network have deeply infiltrated the mainstream media of the Philippines. So the news coverage, unfortunately, this is a very unfortunate reality, that the news coverage of our journalists in the Philippines, mostly, not all, but mostly depict, for example, I will give a concrete example. They depict the Abu Sayyaf group, okay, the ASG. They depict all of Abu Sayyaf group as a global terrorist, as if the entire organization, as if all the members of the ASG are global terrorists. In reality, on ground zero, there are factions. There are 8 factions. 50%, 4 factions are the ones that aligned with ISIS, with Daesh. But the 4 other factions, they remain as local terrorists, and some are even nearly bandits. The one in Sulu, in Basilan, in these areas, these are mere bandits. But the problem is they engage in, there's almost disparate action or the use of force. For example, if they are just bandits in Basilan or the ASG, they are into kidnapping, they are kidnap for ransom, most of the time, and piracy. But they do not engage necessarily in terrorist activities the way the ASG in Lanao, in Cotabato, do. However, in mainstream media, there is no nuance given in the way that, you know, these terrorists, the ASG, the terrorist group, and the other half, which are bandits, they are not nuanced. The discussions are not given. So most Filipinos are not able to understand that only 50% of Abu Sayyaf group pledged allegiance to ISIS, and the other 50% they do not care. They just want to do kidnap for ransom. And you know, like so in at least for my assessment, honestly, it means that the police, the Philippine National Police, which are the ones responsible for handling bandits, they're the ones who should respond to the bandits in Basilan, and then let the armed forces of the Philippines focus their forces on the more important aspect. For example, in Lanao, in Cotabato, where there are terrorists, the Abu Sayyaf that has pledged allegiance to ISIS. So the democracy is the democratic mainstream, the democracy, the freedom of speech in the Philippines is there. I can dare say that it is actually more abused and misused because there is no accountability when mainstream media journalists are, for example, also, second example is also when they portray communist terrorists. You can see a double standard. When the mainstream media portrays CPP, NPA, MBF communist terrorists, they will always, they will blur the faces in the news report. They were, because it's a communist terrorist, and they are communist terrorist operatives, and they are protecting their fellow communist terrorist operatives, so they will blur the faces in their news reports. If it's a terrorist that they say, oh, this, even if it's a child, you know, and the child is associated or linked to ISIS or to Abu Sayyaf, they will publish the photo. They will publish the without blurring the face, even if it's a minor. So, you know, you can see that kind of double standard being practiced. And I have called out a lot of communication centers, even in the Philippine National Police, in the Army, in the Philippine Army, and then the media. I always tell them that there should be no double standard. If we are to blur the faces, and yes, we should do the same for the child soldiers that are being radicalized by ISIS or by Abu Sayyaf and other radical extremists in southern Philippines. So I think in this regard, the problem of Philippines is actually too much freedom. I know this is a very unpopular view, especially coming from a Filipino, but I really think there's too much freedom in our country. Too much freedom that it's completely okay for communist terrorists to spread propaganda and lies and deception, and they do not go to jail. There is no repercussion. There is no accountability. Are there any more aspects to the question or follow up, Mr. Aditya?
Thank you very much for your explanation and your answer. Next, I will be raise hand if I have the question.
Saya lihat susah kondisi apakah segala macam lagi teman saya.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And next we have a question from Najahan Musyaf to Dr. Clark Jones. The question is there any effort or initiative from civil society group in Australia to prevent or counter violent extremism or terrorism? Dr.
Yes,
John?
the short. Thanks for the question. The short answer is yes. There are many civil society organisations that get involved in programs. It depends what you define as a civil society organisation. There are non-government organisations that work with community groups, and there are countless different sorts of programs. I suppose that's a positive thing, you know, so we can generate, you know, more grassroots type or genuine type programs that are not government or police centric, and I think that's really important. My concern is that often there's a lot of funding that's put out there to civil society, but often the people that get the money are not the ones who are actually really working with at-risk youth. We need to be careful, you know, that we ensure that programs are necessarily, and they're also well targeted, and those that are running programs, as I sort of said in my presentation, those that are running programs are well equipped, well versed, and well qualified to be running those programs. Another issue is we don't have the right to work with Muslim communities. You can't just say that I want to run a program and therefore I'm going to work with a Muslim community. We need to be very careful that we don't stigmatize communities. So yes, it's great that we have the development of civil societies, and I think that's civil society involvement in countering violent extremism. But we need to be very careful that what we do and how we develop it is welcome, it is needed, and it's going to address the right issues. I don't think we're there yet, but it is certainly, in terms of program efficacy, programs that are not led by police and that are not led by government stand a far better chance than those that are led by police. And once again, police have I was once a police officer a long time ago. Police have an important role in society, don't get me wrong, but they are not people that run interventions, nor is the government, and civil society has a key role to play.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jones. In the chat room, there is Ahmad Sulfi Fafirus Surabaya. Want to ask to Mrs. Trey Toledo. Ahmad Sulfi, you can unmute your microphone.
Thank you for attention. So I ask a question for Mrs. Andrea Toledo. In Philippines, we know there is terrorist and narcotics crime. So is there connection between terrorism network and drugs network in Philippines? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question, Mr. Ahmad. So in the Philippines, the narco terrorists are part and parcel of every terrorist organization. For the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army, and the National Democratic Front, for the international community, a lot of people do not know that our former DOJ, Department of Justice Secretary Laila de Lima, who is still detained, she's actually a close relative of the wife of Joma Sison, the founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines. So the drug trade, the crystal meth drug trade that made use of the maximum security prison in the National Bilibid prison in Muntinlupa City in the Philippines. This was the idea that was replicated by Sinaloa Drug Cartel. When Sinaloa Drug Cartel was able to enter the Philippines in 2010, during the presidency of the former President Noynoy Aquino. So during the Pinoy administration, call him Pinoy, during the Pinoy administration, the Sinaloa Drug Cartel were able, and four other international drug cartels, including the West African gang, the motorcycle gang, the Triad, the Bamboo Gang, all these international drug cartels have been able to penetrate the archipelago with the blanket consent of higher up, including the Malacanang. This is why the popular leadership of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte and his war on drugs became fully supported by 97% of the Philippine population, because the drug problem is so pervasive in the Philippines, and it has put so much power, because terrorism financing is the lifeblood of every terrorist organization. Without the narco-terrorism, the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, and other organized crimes that are masterminded by communist terrorists in the Philippines, and some radical extremist groups like the group of Isnilon Hapilon, they also they invested in crystal meth, in setting up the biggest crystal meth laboratory in Marawi. So all these things, you cannot set up a massive crystal meth laboratory without buying politicians, without getting the buy-in of corrupt politicians. So when from 2010 to 2016, the narco terrorism is so pervasive that, whereas, let's say, in contrast to 2009 and the years before that, maybe the problem of crystal meth was a problem that maybe truck drivers, some celebrities, those who need to stay awake, call center agents, they were the ones taking it. But 2010 to 2016, children, and when I say children, 8 years old, 7 years old, who are victims of sex trafficking, these children are forced to take crystal meth. They are forced to become addicted to crystal meth by the communist terrorist network. And I know this because this is my father's business. And when they do that, they create dependence. So these children, when they become radicalized, it's also not that they have complete control of their faculty, because they are addicted to crystal meth. So when the war on drugs started, we had more than 1.6 million Filipinos who surrendered, and they are now in rehabilitation centers. And the mainstream media, they do not highlight that. 1.6 million Filipinos voluntarily surrendered. Why did they surrender? Because the narco-terrorists, they took advantage of a loophole. Again, another loophole in the Philippine law. The Philippine law only prosecutes drug pushers, not the drug users. The drug users are not to be incarcerated. They have to be rehabilitated. So what the narco-terrorists did was they created a multi-level marketing design, an MLM system for the distribution of crystal meth. This began in 2010 to 2016, such that you cannot possibly afford if you become a drug addict, you cannot possibly afford your monthly dose of your monthly supply of crystal meth without becoming a supplier. So they knew, the narco-terrorists knew that like Dr. Clark mentioned in his study in the Philippine prison system in 2009 and prior, that the Philippine prison systems are very heavily congested. So the narco-terrorists, they knew that if they created a system wherein all the users will become pushers by design, because of the cost of the monthly supply, then they cannot anymore get out of that drug cartel that made use of the ready infrastructure of the New People's Army. Well, and in the question of Mr. Ahmad, why did the drug cartel, for example, why did Sinaloa drug cartel and the other international drug cartels, why did they work with the CPP and PA? Why did they work with the Communist Party, the New People's Army? Because the New People's Army, the armed wing of the Communist Party, already has its paramilitia. It already has its infrastructure on the ground for drug distribution. So this is the gravity of the problem of crystal meth in the Philippines, which is why it's not easy to be able to completely remove the drug trade, because the armed groups, the terrorist organizations, they have the militia, they have the paramilitia, they have their NPA hitmen, and they moonlight as the bodyguards of narco terrorists, narco politicians. And so in the Philippines, our war against the whole of nation approach to end the communist terrorist insurgency works hand in hand with the drug war, because the drug war is the source of terrorism financing for the most part. And that's why the communist terrorists, especially this upcoming 2022 elections, the communist terrorists are investing so much money to back traditional politicians, corrupt politicians, so that they can buy their way back into the system, because they want to be able to distribute drugs again. 6 years of great difficulty to distribute drugs for the narcos and the communist terrorist network has really affected their financial liquidity. And that's why they're pouring the resources that they have. Again, I must remind everybody that the communist terrorist network has been around for 91 years, not only 53 years for CPP, but 91 years, including the first Communist Party in the Philippines. And this has always been the infrastructure that distributes illegal drugs, illegal weapons, and it's a very difficult situation for law-abiding citizens in the Philippines to fight back, because we do not have the right to bear arms in the Philippines. So only the armed forces of the Philippines, only the Philippine National Police can deal with them, because a regular law-abiding citizen does not have the right to bear arms. And so this is the problem, and the reality that I shared earlier, Mr. Ahmad, is that the children who were used as drug couriers by Abu Sayyaf and CPP NPA, they were the first batch of child soldiers of ISIS under Isnilon Hapilon. And I was able to find these children in the mountain where they were being trained. So this is the reality, that it's so unfortunate that the children are addicted to crystal meth. Some of them are addicted to cell phone games like Clash of Clans, Dota, Mobile Legends. So different kinds of addiction as a form of escapism, because they are trapped in that system. And the whole of nation approach in the Philippines has not yet fully addressed the side of rehabilitation, especially for children that have been exploited by the drug cartels as well, not just the terrorist organization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Toledo. Is there anyone want to ask? Please raise your hand so we can see you. Okay, in the chat room, Mr. Aditya Hadiwasisto from the security manager want to ask directly to Dr. Clark Jones. Okay, Mr. Aditya, you can unmute your microphone.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
Pak John, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks.
I will ask the question. Let me speak something. The emergence of acts of the terror in the last few decades has become the serious concern in Indonesia. The issue of terrorism has often made headlines in the several mass media. Based on the result of the analysis, it can be stated that the suicide bombing was an act of the terrorism, while the other media were more carefully in calling this action a mission of the GAD group. The news discourse of the suicide bombing at the Medan police headquarters is an example, generally favoring the perpetrators. This can be seen the vocabulary used and the grammar in the new sentence that are presented. The news presented is more directed to the condition of the perpetrators. Discourse pattern from each media can be seen with the use of vocabulary which is dominated by active sentence. The question is, how do you see this, that there is a discourse battle from the media itself just for the sake of a new rhetoric? Thank you.
So just to paraphrase that, so how does the media affect the sentencing, you're saying, or the outcome of the criminal justice system? Is that what you're asking?
I'm asking about the media itself for the sake of the news rating.
News rating?
Yes.
Yeah, look, lately the reporting has been much better. For example, when it is quite evident if the attack has been caused by someone of Muslim faith, the reporting has been very careful of late not to automatically say that the person is Muslim, and that's been really important. But previously, really from 9/11 onwards, until very recently, the first thing they would do is they would almost say that the perpetrator is Muslim, and the image, the sensationalized image they create can have serious detrimental effects on the way the case is handled, on the way the case is reporting, and how the public respond to that particular case. I would say that if there's been a stabbing in the street and it's by a person of Muslim faith versus a person who is white and Anglo-Saxon, then it's handled totally differently. In fact, automatically the reference to terrorism is used a lot more quickly, that it's a terrorism incident. So it gets reported differently. It then gets handled differently in the court system. I remember a case of a 17-year-old who was Muslim. I can't remember what cultural background he was, but he had assembled explosives, and he ends up getting a life sentence. He didn't even assemble the material. It was the police who assembled a pipe bomb and detonated it themselves. But the point is, he assembled the pipe bomb. Very, very soon after, there was a very similar case of, it was more on the right-wing side, but a young guy, I think was 18, almost 19, who did very much the same thing. He actually got good behaviour bond and did not get charged at all. So, and I really think that the media and the way things are sensationalized and reported have that influence on the outcomes in the criminal justice system. And that's a really sort of there are many other cases I could compare how different different people are treated based on their type of offending. My concern is the way they report particular cases involving Muslims, and also in terms of my field, how does it end up in the criminal justice system? And there's certainly the Muslim population of young Muslims in the criminal justice system is growing. So we do have to be careful of the bias that is created in the media, if I could answer that question a bit more quickly. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Okay, is there any other question? Well, I will read from the chat room, like from Najihan Musya again to Mrs. Toledo. The question is, what extent the effectiveness of countering terrorism in Philippines, as the movement is also being done through conventional strategy? Thank you.
So for this question, thank you for asking this, Najahan. The effectiveness of countering terrorism in the Philippines is still in its infancy stage. I say that it is still in its infancy stage because the Anti-Terrorism Act, the relatively strong, it's still comparatively weak as compared to other Southeast Asian neighbors, but it is an improvement of our anti-terrorism law, and it was only passed this 2020. However, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 is not yet fully implemented because it is being petitioned and questioned by the communist operatives, those I call communist termites, who come from different universities, media companies that have been filing their petition in the Supreme Court so that the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 will not be implemented as intended in the Philippines. Now, Philippines was recently put in the gray list by the Financial Action Task Force. And this is so because we do not have any conviction for terrorism financing in the Philippines. Considering that there are many terrorist attacks happening in the country, there is zero conviction in terrorism financing. Now, I know for a fact that in the Philippines, we need to improve our Anti-Money Laundering Council, which remains to be very weak in implementation. We have very good policies, so there is no question about the policies. The policies look perfect on paper, but in terms of implementation, it is very poor. there is no coordination, and there is no proper surveillance and proper monitoring. So we also lack proper, like we do not have a specific legal team that can handle and focus only terrorism financing cases. So one example was during the Marawi siege, we were trying to have a terrorism conviction for the terrorism financing that was forced through Farhana Maute and her children and other members of the terrorist organization. Now, the terrorists, they were able to hire the #1 law firm, private law firm in the country, with an acceptance fee of almost $1 million US. Can you imagine? $1 million US just for a legal acceptance fee. Now, arguably, because this private law firm had a very deep bench of very, very good lawyers, they were able to get their clients out of the conviction case, and so the government lost because the government only had one lawyer, and that lawyer was handling 25 other cases at the same time. So there was no proper focus for convicting the terrorism financing that led to the Marawi siege. So my mother, for example, who is the head of terrorism financing, before she died, I have a very complicated relationship with my mother because she was the head of terrorism financing for the Communist Party and the New People's Army. And there was over $200 million US that she was never imprisoned for. Can you imagine? $200 million in Juvenile. It might not be back then. So when my mother wanted to get out of the Communist Party, she was threatened by my father. She wanted to stop stealing. She wanted to, be a law-abiding citizen, and she could not get out because her way out of poverty. My mother is part of the Manobo tribe, one of the indigenous peoples of Mindanao, and she comes from a very poor background. And as a child, she thought her only way out of poverty was to join the terrorist organization, the NPA, so she could go to college. That was how it started. And so the countering of terrorism in Philippines is still in infancy stage. We even have a problem now, and it's a very controversial issue. But the senators and the lawmakers in the Philippines, they are pushing to defund, to abolish the National Task Force to End the Local Communist Armed Conflict. We call it the NTFL-TAC, which is the whole of nation approach to end the more than half a century communist terrorist movement. And now, after only, the National Democratic Front, the Legal Shield, formerly Legal Shield, was only designated a terrorist org in 2021 this year, and they already want to defund the task force, which is very effective. And I agree with Dr. Clark's statement earlier that the whole of nation approach is far more powerful than tapping only the armed forces of the Philippines or tapping only the Philippine National Police for countering violent extremism. The whole of nation approach has been so effective that we have more than 20,000 communist terrorist surrenderers who are alive and are being protected by the Philippine government, so they will not be killed by their fellow former cadre. These former cadres need protection from the Communist Party, because they are. There's a noise. Can kindly mute your microphones, please. So the Communist Party, they are pushing corrupt politicians, to defund and abolish this whole of nation approach, which is highly problematic. And so by 2022, during the elections, we know the government policy is not powerless. The National Task Force is very powerful. That's why they want it to be defunded. That's why they want it to be abolished, because it's so powerful that the infrastructure, the human resource, the pawns, the dispensable pawns of the communist terrorist network, a lot have already surrendered. So now the high-ranking ones in the CPP, NPA, and the Communist Terrorist Network, who continue to control the funds, which have not yet been confiscated, because we still do not have laws that will enable the Philippine government. Because again, I don't want to say that the Philippine government is weak. The Philippine government only started this war against CPP, NPA, and the Communist Terrorist Network in December of 2017. It's been less than 3.5 years. Whereas this terrorist organization has been around for 91 years. So there is a big difference, right? It's not fair to compare the achievements of the whole of nation approach that has been only there for 3 years and then compare it with something that has been around for almost a century, almost 100 years. So we need to be patient. We need to be proactive. And we will make sure that in the 2022 elections, Filipinos are making use of their social media to castigate, to publicly condemn these traditional politicians, these corrupt politicians who are receiving money from the Communist Terrorist Network. So the government is doing its best, but for a certain, it is the vote of 2022 which will make or break the great inroads, the great successes, the achievements of the whole of nation approach to end the local communist armed conflict. Because the Barangay Development Plan, we call it BDP, the Barangay Development Plan goes directly to the more than 800 barangays which are infested by the Communist Terrorist Network. So there were so many surrenderers in these more than 800 barangays. Why? Because the people already feel the governance. People feel that there are infrastructures, there are projects, there are schools, roads, bridges that have been built even during the pandemic. Philippines continued its build program throughout the pandemic, and it has provided employment. And so all these surrenderers from the Communist Terrorist Network have been given a second chance to return to the fold of the law. But again, it will take, statistically speaking, it takes at least 10 years to know if they are sincere. Because globally, we have the situation wherein there is a 75% recidivism rate within the first 10 years of surrenderers. So I hope that was able to answer your question regarding the strategy of the Philippine government to counter terrorism. And I hope that with the help of the US, Australia, EU, Philippines will be able to improve its terrorism conviction for the terrorism financing convictions, which we are still at a 0. So we hope to have at least one conviction before the end of 2021. But if that will not happen, then hopefully by 2022, we will have a terrorism conviction, terrorism financing conviction. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Trey. And we have one more, and also will be our last question for this session. That is Mr. Haposan Hutajulu, security practitioner, to Mr. Jones. The question is how we can assess that someone or individual have been containment with radicalism. Any tools of assessment that will help us to assess, such as ERG-22 or other? Does those tools are effective or less? Dr. Clark, still here.
Thank you for the question, a very timely question, and a question that is very dear to my heart. There are several tools. There's the Vera 2A as well, which is a tool originally designed for within the prison system. There's another tool called, in Australia that is, called the radar tool, that was designed more for external to the correctional system. My problem at the moment is the efficacy and transparency of those tools. So quite often those tools are developed by academics, by think tanks, given to government groups, and the government groups will go and use those, or government agencies will use those risk assessment tools as a definitive answer on whether someone is radicalized or has the potential to use violence. We are also in the process of developing tools or refining risk assessment tools in the Philippine correction system. So for the correctional agencies and for the parole agencies, we understand the limitations of risk assessment tools. So when you're talking about a tool, to say definitively that is someone going to be violent is a very difficult thing to answer. So today I might be violent, but tomorrow I might not be. There are all sorts of circumstances that will lead to someone acting up or being violent. So we've got to ask ourselves, what do we use the tool for? What's the true purpose of the tool? If the tool is to design or to advise on a program, on a rehabilitation program, if the tool is designed to help with placement within the correctional system, whether they'll be high risk, medium risk, or low risk, it's important that we have those tools, don't get me wrong. My concern now is the bias within those tools. And I've seen in the court cases I've been involved with in Australia and New Zealand that those tools will be used to determine the outcome of someone's length of sentence or whether they can be released into the community. I have great problems with that, because if the reliance is only on the tool, then the efficacy of those tools is still at question. The bias is a real problem, because if you are dressed in an Islamic thobe or Islamic dress, you have a beard, or based on your ideological perspective. For example, if you're highly conservative, and forgive me for the label here, but if you're a Salafi, then the more chance that you will be deemed high risk and result in a lengthy sentence or not being released or being given a long-term supervision order. Now, so until we can eliminate bias in some of these radicalization risk assessment tools, we've still got a long way to go, I think. So yes, the tools are important. I develop risk assessment tools along with psychologists so that we can give us some indication within the correctional systems on how to manage that particular offender. That's really important, so don't get me wrong. But if the bias is not eliminated from those tools, because we've got to also remember, get back to the point, what's the reason for offending? What are the risks relating the person, but also what are the protective factors that would prevent offending? There's lots to consider, and I think some of the current risk assessment tools, if there was more transparency and we can validate those tools in an open forum, and if after that validation they were proved to be effective, then no problems. But that's not happening at the moment. So yes, we need tools. Do they need to be refined? Yes, they do. And do we need to understand more about people's religious perspectives? That would be helpful. Because to me, having spent many years now with highly conservative offenders and non-offenders, what I see as radicalized and what's not radicalized may be different to others. My point is, we don't have a good understanding. Those who are developing tools, I don't think, have spent enough time with people to understand backgrounds, reasoning, perspectives, religious explanations. And I think the tools are not being used effectively. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Clark and Dre, for the answer in this discussion and question session. Now I have to close the question session, and we will go forward to the closing statement from Dr. Clark and then Dre Toledo. Maybe Dr. Clark want to give the closing statement first.
Thank
Okay.
you. Yeah, look, there are some fascinating questions, and I like the responses from Mrs. Toledo. We may not agree on some of those points around the offender behaviours and things like that, but that's okay. I think it's a really important to get different perspectives in these sorts of forums, and I think we agree on most. Maybe we don't agree on some of the things, but that's okay. We can have that discussion at another point. But I really enjoyed the insightful questions, which has really challenged us, and it's made me think about some of the perspectives. Getting back onto what I was talking about really how the media can be portrayed and how the media can be responsible or irresponsible in relation to their reporting. It's certainly, they need to think of, if they're going to be responsible media, what impact does that have on the general population? And certainly in Australia, it's been a lot of negative imagery of Muslim communities in Australia. And I do a lot of work on social cohesion and social inclusion. And we want to really be working on social cohesion so that we all can, people of different faiths can live together, of different cultures. Australia is particularly a very multicultural society, and we want to make sure that we all get along. We don't have to be friends, but at least give the attempt to be able to work with people of different backgrounds so you can understand those backgrounds, to be able to live safely and happily together. I've been very fortunate to be able to work with many communities of different backgrounds, different nationalities, different national backgrounds, and it's made my life more valuable and more enriched, and it's certainly helped my career moving forward to have that trusted source of information, but also be able to meet with wonderful people, wonderful families, and eat very interesting food. So I'll leave it at that. And thanks for the opportunity to be able to present today. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure, Dr. Clark. And now we go to Dre Toledo to give your closing statement. Hello, Dre.
Thank you very much. Yes, Tias. Thank you so much for having invited me to talk about how I make use of social media to fight terrorism in the Philippines. As to some of the points of Dr. Clark, yes, I understand that there are differences in the perspective, but also I need to highlight the fact that it is one thing to observe it from the outside, and it is another for you to live in that ecosystem of violence, which I went through. So I know these terrorists far more intimately than most people because I grew up with them. And I was able to enter these layers of where the child soldiers were being trained. Why? Because I'm not afraid to die. You cannot enter those places if you are afraid to die. Because every time I enter those places, there's a big risk I can get beheaded. There's a big risk that I can be attacked. But I go with an open heart. I go with full sincerity because I want to know their stories. I want to know, where do these children come from? What did their parents do to them? Because I know what my parents did to me. And it took so much of good sense of humor, of prayers, of faith, so that I will not choose to be a terrorist. In fact, in the Philippines, my relatives, my clan members think that I am stupid because there's so much power and money in being part of high-ranking terrorist clans. And yet I chose to be outside of that system. I chose to be a law-abiding citizen. So there are my strong views, strong as they may be, in how we must counter terrorism and what standards we should have in order to gauge if a person is truly a sincere surrenderer, if they have truly become law-abiding citizens. It is there because I know that the strategy of communist termites, my family members, is that they pretend to be peaceful people, but they continue to slaughter. They continue to poison, they continue to commit arson, and it does not stop. Just because they say that it has ended, just because they said that they have stopped killing, it does not mean that they have stopped. So this is the reality that when we speak of, for example, Islamophobia in the Philippines, the Islamophobia is there, it's cultivated by communist terrorists, by communist termites, who pretend to be Muslims but are not real Muslims, because Islam is a religion of peace. So this reality, I was able to see it on ground zero, and I hope that there will be more collaboration. For sure, the Philippines has a lot to learn from our foreign partners, especially, and I agree the most with Dr. Clark when it comes to the need for our prison system to be completely overhauled, so that we will have better reformation even within the prison system. And so hopefully we can have that collaboration in the near future, and that together we can also push for a more nuanced coverage of the mainstream media when it comes to the issues of war in southern Mindanao, that they will not automatically equate it, that, oh, it's because of Islam. So that is part of my role, that I want to foster unity and diversity. I want to foster respect for different faiths. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to share my insights today. And have a good weekend soon, very soon. Take care, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Clark and Andrea, for attending this webinar. We hope we can do another collaboration in another opportunity. And now we still have one more speaker from the United Kingdom, Mr. Ahmad Patel. But Mr. Ahmad Patel confirmed that he do not able to join with us today due to the time differences, but he sent recorded presentation, and he will be delightful to answer the question toward him by email, and he will answer it later today. Then we will serve the answer tomorrow at the second day of this international webinar without any further delay. Let's us listening to Mr. Ahmad Patel presentation.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello, and to everyone listening. My name is Ahmad Patel, and I am from Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, UK. Now, unfortunately, the whole world knows of the London 7/7 bombings of 2005. And I unfortunately happen to be the brother-in-law of what we were told later is the ringleader of that atrocity. On the morning of the 12th of July 2005, the security services came to our door along with my entire family and told us that my brother-in-law was one of the perpetrators. In 2005, no member of our family was arrested or questioned by the security services. But despite this, we had to deal obviously with the huge media interest globally and also local rumors. Because this was a huge event, it seemed like a free-for-all for everybody, and there were a lot of assumptions and rumors about our family and also about what had happened in London and who was on or was not involved. Unfortunately, after that, the past few weeks and months, in fact, maybe even years, my own children had to deal with a lot of bullying from even Muslim neighbors. I myself had to deal with a lot of negative comments from Muslims, even Muslim imams and Muslim organizations on the internet. as I was quite heavily involved on going on Muslim forums and asking Muslims to deal with the situation. And I was also I was trying to make Muslim organizations, mosques and imams be aware that this incident could happen again or something similar could happen again. But I was largely, unfortunately, met with denial and what I call whataboutery. In other words, it was a concern, but not a priority. So as I've said in previous interviews, before the 12th of July 2005, I used to be known as the son of my father, and after the 12th of July, I am now unfortunately known globally as the brother-in-law of the bomber. Up until 2016, September 2016, when I did my first interview with the BBC, I still led a very private life, and this was due to the safety concerns of my children who were all attending school. Though ironically, it was unfortunately a few Muslim children who bullied my children. This actually is a kind of proof, really, that most or all Muslims here also abhor terrorism and Muslim terrorists, because there have been accusations made here that Muslims or some Muslims secretly support terrorism. Well, if Muslims or some Muslims secretly support terrorism, then my children would not have been bullied. One of the reasons I went public in 2016 is after years of research, years of books that I read, and also media, watching media coverage after other terrorism incidents like the Ligby incidents, and then also the lead up to ISIS, and then also noticing how so many so-called experts, authors were stating, to put it politely, mistakes in their books. So I was going very frustrated, and in September 2016, I decided to go public. As we are discussing the effects of media here, I think we now have to split media into a few different categories. We have mainstream media, which can be classed as newspapers and TV channels. And then now, more recently, we have social media. And then the other media, which I do want to talk about, is the books or so-called lectures by so-called experts, because I have found many mistakes by so-called experts over the years, which I will detail later. There is also the issue of terminology when it comes to terrorism by Muslims, which is also a debate I am also constantly dealing with. But unfortunately, when it comes to Muslim terrorists, there doesn't seem to be any particular way of glossing over this unfortunate fact, whether you use the term Islamism or Islamist or Muslim terrorist or terrorist who is a Muslim. It's something that we will have to deal with, because the unfortunate fact is, as we know, if a Muslim commits an act of terrorism, many of them recite the kalima, many of them say Allahu Akbar, and as we know with ISIS, they use the flag with the kalima. Even though recently we have found that the seal of the Prophet was a fake, as I have recently read. But when Muslims have used some Quran ayat or use some historic incident in Islam to justify murder and terrorism, it's something we still need to deal with. So initially, in the first few years, the one word that was constantly thrown out or articles were about linking Muslim terrorists to Islam and mosques and imams. Despite many cases, and despite even the official government report of 7/7, where no mosque or imam has been connected to that incident. As I live in Dewsbury, and whilst my brother-in-law was married to my sister, he spent some time in Dewsbury even up to today, there are authors and media who constantly want to link 7/7 to Dewsbury. In fact, even more directly to Dewsbury Markaz, which is completely wrong. Dewsbury Markaz being the Tablighi Jamaat headquarters of Europe. So it is shocking that despite the official government report of 7/7 not even linking the atrocity to any mosque or imam or the Tablighi Jamaat, still up to today, some authors and some media will make that wrong link. I also have two recent examples of two recent anti-terror raids, once again in Dewsbury, my hometown, where people were arrested. And in both cases, everybody who was arrested was released. In fact, in one case, one particular newspaper shockingly said, amongst with others, that oh, this is believed to be linked to a plot to massacre people in leisure parks in the UK. Now, these individuals who were arrested were released, but the media had already done the damage in two ways. One, by using the name Dewsbury once again, and sometimes also when they mention Dewsbury, they will always refer to Seven, saying like, oh, it also happens to be the town of the ringleader of the 7/7 bombings. Whereas my brother-in-law hardly ever spent any time in Dewsbury. He, in fact, hated the Tablighi Jamaat. He believed his prayers would not even be accepted in any mosque in Dewsbury, simply because all of the mosques around my area are all Sufi mosques, and most Salafi Takfiris, as we know, hate Sufism, and my brother-in-law did not even believe his prayers would be accepted in these mosques. But unfortunately, the media, whenever there is something similar, a similar story, or an alleged case, they like to link it. Some media want to link it to a mosque. Some media want to link it back to Dewsbury and the Tablighi Jamaat, which is completely wrong. As I say in this case, the leisure complex murder case, both the suspects were released without charge, so there was no plot. The other more recent case was raids on a takeaway once again in Dewsbury with I think 5 to 6 people arrested, and they were all released once again without charge. But once again, because this was in Dewsbury, some media straight away said, oh, this is in Dewsbury. This also happens to be the town of the 7/7 bomber. So we can quite safely say that there, as I say on my social media, that there are people out there who want to deal with facts, and there are people out there who do not want to deal with facts, but they have agendas, which is completely wrong, especially since if you mention a mosque or an innocent location linking to terror, you are putting that mosque or innocent people at risk. Going back to 7/7 and 2007, and there was a case linked to some friends of my brother-in-law, and once again some media reported without any substance, or there were also plots to bomb or murder people in Trafalgar Square, London, once again, there was no reality there, but the media or some media chose to put out those headlines. And the problem is that whether these are true or not, the headlines are out there and they have been read, and those with agendas will remember these headlines even if they are completely wrong and unsubstantiated. Going on to social media now, more recently we have had a case of an individual with supposedly a vest. Before even facts came to light, people were assuming on social media that this will be a Muslim, but we now have further details that this was actually someone with mental health problems and who converted to Christianity. As this is an ongoing case, you might want to delete this comment. Another problem I have had is with experts or so-called expert authors. Many books that I have read over the years once again wrongly link terrorists to mosques and imams. Most mosques and imams in the UK can be considered Sufi mosques, and obviously Islam itself abhors it and is against terrorism. But whenever there is even a suspected case, some media unfortunately decide to try to interview local imams or put pictures of mosques on the local mosques on their pages. This wrongly links innocent individuals, innocent mosques, buildings to alleged terror cases. Alhamdulillah, now since I went public in 2016, I have now managed to reach a global audience, right from Australia to North America, South Canada, and South America and Europe. And recently, I contributed to a book by a Dr. Lewis Harrington called "Understanding Islamist Terrorism in Europe." So when I came on the scene, I was now able to challenge so-called experts and media with facts. And there are unfortunately some experts or so-called experts out there that don't like me simply because I can refute their books, or I can look at some paragraphs in and I can point out quite rightly that what they have stated is wrong. But the problem is with any media, whether it's mainstream, social, or books, is that once something has been said or printed and read, it stays obviously within the minds of people. Those people who are interested in facts and evidence will be prepared to change their minds, and those people who have a bias or who just want to blame Islam and Muslims for something which is, as we know, already haram in Islam, they will blame people who are also unfortunately blaming our dear Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-Mosque and Islam and the Quran for the acts of criminal terrorists. The book by Dr. Lewis Harrington actually has 80 cases of Muslim terrorists or Islamists, however you want to call it, where they had mental health problems, mental health issues, family problems, childhood trauma, and some were already suicidal. Though Alhamdulillah, as I have said, through my many efforts in talking to lecturers, authors, think tanks, and the university think tanks globally, Alhamdulillah, I have managed to change the mind or influence some people who in the future will be able to educate others better on the issue of Muslim terrorism. Now, why do I use the term Muslim terrorism and not Islamism or any other label? Because unfortunately, a terrorist who commits an act of terrorism is still a Muslim. And so this is another separate debate on terminology, though we can also use the term Khawarij. And there is a excellent article linked to this. We also have to differentiate between left-wing media and media in UK and Europe, though I have to say it's quite fair and balanced, but obviously certain newspapers and outlets have their own bias. And sometimes when they do make mistakes, they do issue apologies, but the problem is the apologies are rarely read. What is read by most people, as we know, is the big major headlines on the front pages. Another thing I noticed when my brother and sister were arrested is that on the hour, every hour, it was the headline that, oh, the wife and brother-in-law of the seven from but when they were released, it was just one short article. This is not publicized in the same way as their arrest is publicized, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Another accusation towards family members or neighbors or mosques is that, oh, you must have known, or didn't you know anything? Well, in this case, I am grateful to the security services of the UK who work by evidence. And as I have stated in 2005, no family member of ours was arrested, though in May 2007, my younger brother and sister were arrested, but they were both without charge within 6 days. But as I have just said, the release was mentioned just once in small media to have. So I think now for the greatest media people who are individuals who may be inclined towards terrorism from their own particular extremism. I think we need to show them avenues, positive avenues of how to deal with their anger. One of the things that I constantly say here in the UK is that we should not be focusing on Middle Eastern issues, but we should be focusing on self-reformation, personal reformation, and community reformation. I also personally believe that one of the greatest harms that has come to us these past few years is the rise of political Islam and the demise of traditional introspective Sufi Islam. The reason I say this is because my brother-in-law absolutely abhorred Sufi Islam. So I take it that Sufi Islam, Tazkiyah, is the opposite of a politicized terrorist, what you could call takfiri. The Takfiri ideology is one where some Muslims think they are so pious that any other Muslim who disagrees with them is also a kafir. And as we know, and I have sent a link to a slide that Takfiris can also be labeled Khawarij, and it would be better for researchers or third media in the future to use the term Khawarij, though as I've said, unfortunately, some people will just want to blame Islam and Muslims, even though Muslims throughout history themselves, we have had to deal with the Khawarij. Unfortunately, as this is a huge subject which I have been researching for over 15 years now, and I can talk about this particular subject for hours on end. Due to the time constraints, I will have to leave this for now, but I am adding some links to some of regarding some of the things I have said. Jazakallah and assalamu alaikum to everyone. Questions can be submitted via email or via the university, and I hope one day maybe I can talk live and take questions. Assalamu alaikum.
About his life journey that is not easy on how to cope with the negative stigma, ostracized and bullied for a very, very long time because of things that done by someone who were not even related by blood. And the question for Mr. Ahmed Patel will be collected, then we'll get the answer directly from Mr. Ahmed Patel later today, and we will serve it tomorrow during the second day of this webinar. And because all of the speakers already presented their presentation, I would like to say thank you once again to the Honorable Sunan Kalijaga State Islamic University, Rector Professor Dr. Phil Al-Makin, the Dean of the Faculty of Dakwah and Communication, Professor Dr. Marhum, our international speakers, Dr. Clark Jones, Ms. Andrea Toledo, audiences for attending this webinar. I would like to invite to close this webinar. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi
Waalaikumsalam
wabarakatuh.
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much to our
Warahmatullahi
in the
wabarakatuh.
plenary session. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all from the webinar today. And finally, we come to the end of the agenda. But before we close this agenda, I would like to remind you to fill in the of attendance. And we would like to announce you that tomorrow we will have Zoom meeting. For further information, please wait for the next announcement. To all the participants, please do not leave the room first, and please turn on your camera because we will take pictures together. And to the committee, please handle this photo session. Aku Okay. First slide, please smile. Next. Next slide. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for joining the webinar today. I'm Febri Aldiansyah and Salsabila Sajjad Azara, student of Department Communication and Islamic Broadcasting, Faculty of Dakwah and Communication, as the Master of Ceremony. We apologize if we have a lot of mistakes, and let's close our agenda today by saying Hamdallah together.
Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim.
See you tomorrow.
Nun, al-qalami wa ma yasturun, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum. Hello, and to everyone listening. My name is Ahmad Patel.
Ada perjalanan panjang sebelum perkuliahan ini kuakhiri. Jadi teringat saat aku bingung akan berkuliah di mana. Saat aku lulus SMA, aku tak bingung dalam memilih KPI sebagai jurusanku, karena komunikasi merupakan hal yang relevan untuk aku dalami pada era digital seperti sekarang ini. Prodi Komunikasi dan Penyiaran Islam Fakultas Dakwah dan Komunikasi Universitas Islam Negeri Sunan Kalijaga merupakan prodi yang mengintegrasikan ilmu komunikasi dengan dasar keislaman dengan kompetensi dasar mahasiswa sebagai pendakwah di era digital. Prodi KPI memiliki sejumlah 149 SKS dengan 44 mata kuliah wajib dan 22 mata kuliah pilihan yang disesuaikan dengan konsentrasi yang diminati. Visi dan misi Prodi Komunikasi dan Penyiaran Islam merupakan turunan dari visi UIN Sunan Kalijaga dan Fakultas Dakwah dan Komunikasi. Terdepan dalam pengkajian dan pengembangan ilmu-ilmu komunikasi dan penyiaran Islam yang berparadigma Islam. Menyelenggarakan pendidikan di bidang ilmu komunikasi dan ilmu-ilmu agama Islam dan integrasi di antara keduanya. Mengembangkan penelitian di bidang komunikasi dan penyiaran. Meningkatkan peran serta pada pengabdian masyarakat dalam aktivitas dakwah. memperluas jaringan kerjasama untuk mengoptimalkan tridharma perguruan tinggi. KPI, sesuai dengan namanya, prodi ini mengintegrasikan ilmu komunikasi umum dengan pendekatan ilmu keislaman agar tercipta generasi muda yang pandai memanfaatkan media komunikasi untuk menyebarkan dakwah Islam.
Komunikasi dan penyiaran Islam UIN Sunan Kalijaga memiliki 3 konsentrasi yang bisa kalian pilih.
Broadcasting, jurnalistik, dan analis media.
Konsentrasi broadcasting berfokus pada pengembangan teori dan keterampilan media penyiaran. Di sini, konsentrasi broadcasting didukung dengan fasilitas pusat pengembangan teknologi dakwah yang diisi dengan 3 komunitas, yaitu Sunan Kalijaga Televisi, Radio Siaran Dakwah, serta Desain dan Fotografi Komunikasi.
Sarjana yang mempunyai pemahaman mendalam tentang pengetahuan dan pengamalan ajaran agama Islam, mempunyai kemampuan komunikasi yang baik, serta keahlian dalam bidang broadcasting, seperti mendesain produksi program penyiaran yang sesuai dengan kebutuhan khalayak dan pasar, membuat program acara penyiaran, dan membuat naskah program siaran yang sesuai dengan asas, arah, dan tujuan undang-undang penyiaran. Memiliki kemampuan percaya diri untuk berbicara di depan publik seperti MC, penyiar radio, reporter, dan news anchor.
Konsentrasi jurnalistik berfokus pada pengembangan teori dan keahlian mahasiswa sebagai seorang jurnalis. Di sini terdapat